From the three-man machine gun to a lightweight weapon, it changed the tactics of battle. From crashing with no hope to a chance of survival, it revolutionized pilot safety. And from spotting danger by eye to hearing it with sonar, it changed navigation. These were all inventions of the 1910s, a decade dominated and defined by the First World War. The parachute, pop-up toaster, and a submachine gun were all inventions that shook the world. Jumping out of planes for an adrenaline rush, or dropping from high altitude on a military mission would have been impossible before the bravery of one humble coal miner. In 1912, Greenville, Pennsylvania, Stefan Banich had just finished another shift on the mine. He was daydreaming about a better life when a tragedy right in front of him changed his life completely. A plane fell out of the sky and crash landed. The pilot didn't stand a chance because he didn't have a parachute. The incident haunted Banich, but also fueled his inventive mind. A Slovakian immigrant, he had studied engineering at night school, hoping it would free him from his life as a laborer.
With his personality, a fixer, a solver of problems, he started to think of ways that the pilot could have been saved.
Only 9 years earlier, the Wright brothers had taken their first flight. The early airplanes were dangerous and often broke down in mid-air. Banich realized aviation was the way of the future, if only it could be made safer.
Everybody else was working on getting up in the air. Stefan Banich apparently thought there ought to be a way that when that contraption falls out of the air, that we can get the pilot back to the ground safely.
The idea of a parachute was not new, but nobody had developed a design that worked and could be patented. The arrival of the airplane inspired several designs in the early 20th century, including a parachute in a backpack, but none was successful. In 1912, Frenchman Franz Reichelt suffered a terrible fate with his hand-sewn silk wings concept. He leapt off the top of the Eiffel Tower, but his wings didn't work, and he died in front of hundreds of spectators. Banich thought future tragedies could be prevented with better engineering.
You had to have something, obviously, if you're falling through the air. What would you have to slow that fall down? So it would have to be some type of thing like an umbrella or a conical shape that in fact would capture the air and create resistance.
Banich thought a parachute would work using drag. First, he had to design a device that would open so that it trapped air underneath, which would create air resistance or drag, and dramatically slow the speed of his fall, allowing for a safe landing. Banich began to build his parachute. He used canvas for the canopy and sewed it by hand. He attached poles that could expand and contract, similar to a telescope.
It had a harness on the hips, and then these rods, when he would open it, it would come up using his arms, and then it would extend on telescopic poles. You would use your arms to deploy the parachute, so to speak. Kind of the reverse, we'd think of an umbrella, we'd hang under it. In this case, he put it underneath the arms because that way he at least had some control of whether it stayed open or not.
Banich was ready to test his prototype. A man in a skirt on the beams of a barn wasn't something his neighbors were used to witnessing.
Are you all right, mister?
He suffered a few bumps and bruises, but the chute did slow his fall.
Yeah, I can imagine a neighbor seeing, the local guy jumping off the roof of his barn. He'd probably run downtown and say, come on out, there's a crazy guy out here jumping off the barn.
With each additional jump, he improved his design. He made the parachute larger, as more surface area meant he could trap more air, which increased the chute's resistance to the force of gravity. However, to obtain a patent, he had to prove that it worked from a much greater height. So he planned a very public and very risky demonstration, leaping from the top of a building in Washington within sight of the US Patent Office. On the 3rd of June 1914, Banich prepared to jump off the roof.
I think anybody that jumps a parachute has confidence that it's going to open. He believed in himself, believed in his design, so he was willing to make the jump.
The descent was perfect. The publicity stunt worked as Banich got a patent for his parachute. It was an achievement that also attracted the attention of the US military.
The Army became very interested in a device or the concept of getting a pilot out of a broken airplane to the ground safely. First World War did that. They found out when they lost pilots, they couldn't replace them, and they had to find a solution.
So Banich offered his patent to the US Army. His reward was a lifetime membership in the Army Air Corps. The military modified his parachute, making it more practical for airmen, and it soon became standard issue for US pilots.
I always say never turn down the person with ideas and thoughts and dreams, because that's what creates tomorrow.
Today, Banich's parachute skirt is a quirky museum piece, but it started a revolution in pilot safety. Other inventions from the decade. 1910, neon lights illuminated cities because a French chemist ran an electric current through neon gas and discovered that it glowed. 1911, the Murphy bed, a mattress that hid by day and provided a few funny scenes for Charlie Chaplin. And 1913, the assembly line. Started by Henry Ford to make more Model Ts, it launched an era of mass production. Both bats and dolphins use it. Sonar, echoing sound waves that enable them to hunt. Developing a way for humans to navigate using sonar became a goal for one of the century's most prolific inventors. April 1912, near Boston, Massachusetts.
Hello?
Reginald Fessenden was about to receive some news that changed the course of his life.
Oh, good Lord. Thank you.
It also affected sailing and navigation.
Dearest, the Titanic. It sunk.
The Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable, but her crew spotted an iceberg too late, and the world's most advanced steamship ended up at the bottom of the Atlantic. The disaster triggered the need for a device that detected objects underwater. And just a month later, British meteorologist Lewis Richardson registered the first patent for an echo-ranging machine. Fessenden also wondered if better tools could have saved the Titanic. Only 6 years previously, he was the first to broadcast using AM radio. But the invention didn't make him any money. In 1912, he was working for a marine navigation company, trying to build a better hydrophone, a crude underwater microphone that helped sailors pick up sounds. However, the Titanic disaster brought a completely different meaning to his assignment.
I think Fessenden was very much motivated by the sinking of the Titanic, and I think he knew a way he could create a device that would prevent that disaster from happening again.
Fessenden's earlier work with sound waves had given him an idea. What if ships could be fitted with a device that not only received underwater signals, similar to the hydrophone, but also transmitted them? Fessenden knew that when the outgoing signal hit an object, like an iceberg, it bounced back. But the time it took to bounce back would reveal how far away the object was. Fessenden was exploiting a phenomenon that occurred in nature: sonar.
If you've ever been to the Grand Canyon and yelled and heard the echo coming back, that's a form of sonar. You're transmitting a sound pulse using your vocal cords. You're doing it loudly with your hands cupping it to project the sound in a certain direction, and you're waiting for that echo to come back.
Fessenden had to work out how to generate and receive man-made signals underwater, so expanded upon his previous work with radio waves and electromagnetics. Fessenden and his assistant built a sturdy metal drum, inside which was an electric motor that generated two magnetic fields. These magnetic fields would react against each other, causing a copper tube inside the drum to vibrate against a metal plate. And it was this movement that created the sound waves. The machine was also designed to work in reverse, as a receiver. It took months to complete the prototype. It was a rugged apparatus that would not leak. In April 1914, the Fessenden oscillator was ready to be tested at sea. It had been 2 years to the month since the Titanic had sunk in the North Atlantic, and Fessenden was headed to the same waters to test his invention, courtesy of the US Coast Guard.
Thank you very much, Captain. Greatly appreciated.
My pleasure. The ship was steam-powered, so it was loud, it was dirty, it smelled, and there was no luxury cabins on board, so it wasn't a pleasant trip.
It was dangerous, too. There were icebergs everywhere.
I see one.
They saw an iceberg, got the crew together to get the oscillator ready. They lowered the oscillator over the side.
They sent a sound wave toward the iceberg and waited for the echoing signal.
They were using very crude methods, counting the number of sound pulses that went out and measuring with a stopwatch how long it took.
The echo wave bounced back from the iceberg. Fessenden had proved his machine could detect objects.
Repeat that whole exercise. Transmit pulses, listen for the echo. What range did they get? Meanwhile, elsewhere on the ship, they would measure with geometry means how far away they were from the iceberg, so they had a sanity check on it. What did the sonar say? What did the other method, which is a geometrical method? What are the differences between those two? How close did we get?
The next stage was to move and test how far the signal carried after hitting the iceberg.
And I think they lost contact with it at a range of about 2 miles, which would have been plenty distance to avoid hitting an iceberg if you were on a ship heading towards one.
Fessenden had done it. He'd built a better hydrophone. And he had also built and successfully tested a revolutionary way to detect objects underwater.
For Fessenden, the oscillator working and measuring the distance to an iceberg would have made him, at the very least, privately elated, because he knew when he set out to design the oscillator that it would serve as the hydrophone that the submarine signal company wanted, a better one, a good one, but it would also be able to measure the distances to objects, namely icebergs. So that was his vindication.
During the First World War, Fessenden's device was used to pick up the sound of enemy submarines. But it took further development before the oscillator was used as Fessenden intended, to measure nautical distance and depth, and to the system used today.
The revolution that the Fessenden oscillator created was in depth sounding. Anyone that owns a boat, whether it's an ocean liner or a submarine or a destroyer or a small boat that's used for fishing, has a depth sounder in it. And every one of those people owes thanks to Reginald Fessenden and his oscillator, because he was there first.
It was another achievement from a brilliant inventor. Fessenden didn't stop, though, and by the end of his life, he had more than 500 patents. Other ideas of the 1910s. 1916, the tank arrived on the battlefields of Europe, inspired by a British officer who envisioned the firepower of a machine gun combined with the traction of a caterpillar. And 1913, a journalist from Liverpool published the first word cross in the New York World, and crosswords were born. Today, it's standard issue, saving firefighters' lives. The self-contained breathing apparatus, or SCBA. They'd been around for years, but in 1916, one man braved an inferno using his own safety hood to save lives. And the ensuing publicity led to US firefighters using the SCBA. In 1912, almost everyone in Cleveland had heard of Garrett Morgan, a high-powered businessman, both well-connected and respected. He was the son of former slaves and had risen to heights that most African Americans of the day could only dream of.
I consider Garrett Morgan to be the African American entrepreneur of the early 20th century. He was the first African American to own an automobile in Cleveland, which automatically puts him in a very elevated category of not just African Americans, but of just American citizens at that time. So clearly he's running a very large operation.
Garrett Morgan was also mechanically brilliant. As a teenager, he worked in a textile plant and showed a flair for fixing machines. By the time he was in his 30s, Morgan was running his own clothing factory. Then one day, a tragic news story struck him. 146 people died in a burning garment factory. It was something that happened often at the time. Shop floors were crowded and cluttered fire traps. And even if rescuers got into a burning building, they didn't have the equipment to aid them.
I think of all inventors as people that have a host or a long list of problems that are circulating through their heads, and they're always looking around to find opportunities. And I think probably the idea of figuring out how to create an apparatus where you could breathe in a fire had probably been floating in his head for a very long period of time.
Morgan's inventor brain began to think. He imagined a situation where firefighters could enter a raging blaze, wearing a breathing device that gave them time to rescue victims.
There's a possibility to revolutionize the way in which firefighting is performed.
Morgan started to experiment with fire to discover how to beat its deadly effects. The smoke contained toxic gases and particles, but if these didn't kill you, the heat probably would, as lung tissue literally vaporizes at 150 degrees Celsius. He needed a source of air that was cleaner and cooler, and he found it near the floor. Even if it was not entirely clean, the air was breathable and cooler.
So probably he thought that, well, if he could get his device down to the level of where the air was cleaner, you would have a stronger opportunity to breathe.
Good afternoon, Frank. Good afternoon, Garrett.
This inspired Morgan to develop a simple concept. Using the tools of his own trade, he began to work with help from his brother.
What you want to do is make sure that you line along the seam here so it's nice and even. Okay. And then you stitch your way through.
They sewed an airtight canvas hood with tiny stitches to keep out the smoke. Transparent eyepieces were made of a heat-resistant material called mica. But the key to making his device work were the two hoses that served as breathing tubes. The longer hose almost reached to the ground. When the fireman inhales, air passed through a water-soaked sponge that filtered out soot and smoke. The breath was exhaled through the shorter second tube, which ran from the mouth to the top of the hood. A ball valve allowed the air to escape, but prevented smoke from entering the hood. Morgan called his invention the safety hood. He thought it could provide at least 15 life-saving minutes for a firefighter. A device so simple, anyone could use it. And it was also inexpensive.
He understood that every little town has a fire department, and if he could sell one device to every fire department or police department, he would probably have a very strong business going ahead.
Morgan demonstrated his invention to fire departments. But what helped Morgan's safety hood over others was a tragedy close to his home, and not in the type of fire he had planned for. In July 1916, the city of Cleveland was building a tunnel under Lake Erie. One night, workers accidentally hit a pocket of gas that triggered an explosion. When rescuers tried to enter the tunnel, they were overcome by fumes, smoke, and heat.
Finally, one individual says, well, I know about this safety hood device thing that I've heard about, and the inventor lives in town, so let's give him a call.
Hello, Garrett Morgan speaking. Come.
Morgan arrived at the disaster site with his invention, but nobody dared to be the first to try it. The only way to prove that his device worked was to head into the gassy inferno himself. He descended 60 meters into a subterranean hell.
Anybody here?
His lifeline was a piece of technology that had never been tested in a dangerous environment.
You're descending underneath Lake Erie and going through a series of locks to open doors and gates to let the methane or the gas out and to find these individuals.
Morgan's invention seemed to be working. He was breathing in less toxic air from near the tunnel floor. He then found the first survivor.
Anybody can help me here?
When he arrived above ground, carrying the injured worker, the crowd couldn't believe it.
Morgan was able to save 2 people individually, and then it's believed that fire officials donned 2 more helmets, were able to bring out 2 more individuals alive.
News of Morgan's bravery and his device spread quickly. More than 500 cities bought his safety hood for their fire departments.
I put the Morgan's hood in the same context as the gas mask, as the same context as the spacesuit. I put it in this larger kind of scale of devices that allow you to enter environments where oxygen is not available. And I think that, for me, is what's amazing, interesting about Morgan's invention.
Morgan was awarded a gold medal of bravery from the citizens of Cleveland for his heroics in the tunnel. And the huge publicity helped revolutionize the safety of firefighters around the US. It's a modest appliance, but judging by its numbers, it would be sorely missed. There are 700 million pop-up toasters on the planet. Thanks to a stubborn mechanic who settled for nothing less than perfection. In January 1919, at a Minnesota farm machinery factory, Charles Stride was looking forward to his favorite lunchtime treat.
My grandfather enjoyed toast immensely, and I think he probably ate toast every day of his life. It was something he loved.
So when the toast was burnt, again, he was extremely disappointed.
My grandfather despised burnt toast. He did have a temper, and I can imagine that he would get up out of his seat and go storming into the kitchen and demand of the chef that he give him decent brown toast and not burned.
Look at this toast. It's burnt. What do you want from me? Give me the toaster. Hey!
He just made a decision to invent a toaster that made perfect toast.
As Charles settled down to build a better toaster, his family knew they wouldn't see much of him until he had succeeded.
He would work tirelessly day and night. I know that he would not show up for dinner. He would work till wee hours in the morning, and he became totally obsessed with his inventions.
Charles was tackling an invention that had stumped many people before him. As he soon discovered, toast was complex. Bread needed a very high temperature, 155 degrees Celsius, to ensure its sugars and starches caramelized. But the high temperature also meant, if you turned your back, even for a second, it was usually a second too long. Earlier inventors had made some breakthroughs, though, and came up with a lot of eye-popping designs.
The options for toasters at the beginning of the 20th century were quite primitive. There was an open and closed toaster. You'd put the toast in on each side, close it up, and then watch it carefully so that it wouldn't burn up.
There had been one important breakthrough in 1905, an alloy called nichrome, 80% nickel, 20% chromium, and it made the perfect heating wire. It had a high melting point, so reduced fire risks and prevented the wires from self-destructing. Charles got an idea. How about using the nichrome wires in a different way? He envisaged heating elements on both sides of the bread, so everything toasted at the same time, along with a special venting system or baffling that would ensure the toast browned evenly all over.
The baffling system creates movement of air. by inserting a metal strip in with the coils. It creates airflow, and the heat is evenly dispersed over all of the toast.
Charles started to experiment with a prototype for double-sided toasting. He made progress, but there was still the timing problem. Everything was still getting burnt. So Charles developed another idea. He installed a timer in his toaster that turned the electricity off automatically when the toast had reached perfection. Most brilliantly of all, he attached the timer to a spring, so the toast popped up all on its own.
It worked beautifully. It answered all the things that anybody would want with a toaster.
Charles filed for a patent in May 1919. All he had to do was sell his toaster. The first model that went on sale was a commercial version that toasted 8 slices at a time.
He loaded up his car with toasters. My father at the time was about 17 years old, and they traveled across the country, and they went to restaurants from the East Coast to the West Coast, selling their toasters one at a time.
Once customers sampled a piece of Charles Streit's perfect restaurant toast, they wanted it at home.
The toaster was the best piece of restaurant equipment they had ever purchased and brought them more business than any other thing they had in the restaurant.
So he then introduced the first domestic version, the Toastmaster 1A1.
It seems like a small thing, but really, it seemed that every household then decided they wanted a toaster, which was an invention that just took off.
Charles had proved his point, and his toaster was such a success that he was able to leave his job and retire. Other inventions of the decade. 1913, X-ray tubes looked below the skin, opening a new way to diagnose. And 1914, the brassiere supported and liberated a New York socialite who wanted a break from the pain and bulk of the whalebone corset. The submachine gun completely changed close-range combat. Today, there are dozens of variations, from the Uzi to the latest Chris Super V. They're deadly descendants of the Tommy gun, nicknamed after its inventor. In 1914, General John Thompson was one of the world's leading weapons experts, a logistics genius who understood the science of war.
John Thompson was the leading firearms expert for the United States, but he was also, in his own right, capable of taking ideas that were radical and applying them to usable technology for his own military.
Thompson graduated top of his class from West Point, the prestigious military academy in the US. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, he was in charge of delivering weapons to the battle area in Cuba. He went on to develop new weapons for the military, including a new bolt-action service rifle.
He also had the capability, though, of seeing what was coming over the horizon and how the American Army had to change and adapt to that environment.
And that would be the outbreak of the First World War. The US had yet to join the fight. But Thompson knew US soldiers would need updated weapons to keep pace with the Europeans.
The weapons aren't powerful enough. They may need something better.
He then left the military to develop his ideas with a private company.
He felt that individual companies had more freedom of thought and of design, whereas the Army kind of had it the Army way only.
In the trenches across Europe, the Great War was turning into a grueling stalemate. When either side tried to mount an attack by running across no man's land, the enemy just simply mowed them down with a new powerful weapon, the machine gun.
The typical machine gun of World War I was a heavy crew-served weapon, typically 3 to 4 men. But once you had it in position, it was a decimating weapon.
The machine gun fired up to 600 rounds a minute, and advancing soldiers with bolt-action rifles just didn't stand a chance.
The soldier had to extract the shell after firing it manually, and then recharge the weapon to fire his next round.
Thompson realized that a new type of weapon was needed, one which gave the foot soldiers a degree of chance, something that was capable of rapid fire without manual reloading, such as a machine gun, but light and portable, similar to a rifle. In other words, a handheld machine gun.
What this means to the common soldier is that he can put more bullets on target faster than what he could with a bolt-action rifle.
But building a portable machine gun wouldn't be easy. The first challenge was a component called a breech lock. At the moment of firing, it locked the firing chamber, delaying blowback that could kill the operator. It's a necessity for any rapid-fire weapon. But breech-lock designs, such as the one on a Vickers machine gun, were far too heavy and complicated for the lightweight weapon Thompson was trying to build. Thompson searched for months, but he eventually found it. A breech lock that relied on physics, not mechanical force, meaning the parts were small and light. It was invented by a retired naval commander, John Blish.
Thompson knew John Blish, and so he approached him to get access to that patent to see if it could be used in a semi-automatic rifle.
Blish knew from his experience of firing guns on warships that different types of metal tended to stick together under high pressure, creating a non-mechanical locking system. His patent relied on bronze locking against steel. Thompson fitted his prototype with a Blish lock. He fits the H-shaped bronze lock into the steel breech of his gun. When the gun was fired, extreme pressure in the chamber propelled the bullet forward. That pressure also caused the bronze and steel parts to lock briefly against each other, delaying the blowback of the bolt, just long enough for the bullet to move safely down the barrel. As the pressure dropped, the bronze and steel parts stopped sticking together, and the firing bolt blew back, ejecting the empty casing. The firing chamber was then ready for a fresh bullet.
John had a tremendous vision in trying to take this Blish locking system and create a whole new generation of firearms.
It seemed as if Thompson had overcome his greatest technical challenge. So in 1916, he formed a company to start building his new weapon. A few months later, a prototype was ready for testing. But after just a couple of shots, the Blish lock became jammed. Thompson's rifle ammunition was too high-powered, so it was damaging the lock. A fatal flaw that would have made Thompson's weapon unreliable and useless. But then Thompson's chief engineer had a brainwave. Use less powerful ammunition from a pistol, something like a Colt 45.
It was kind of one of those euphoric moments when the light bulb went on.
After some adjustments to their prototype, it was back to the firing range to test their gun with the new ammunition.
It went from having a high-powered rifle cartridge to a pistol cartridge.
Using the less powerful pistol cartridges worked, and the lock didn't jam. It was a huge success for Thompson, but there were more hurdles ahead. Machine guns, such as the Vickers, used a belt to feed ammunition. But a belt wouldn't work in a lighter, portable gun.
The problem was that the gun was so fast-firing and so lightweight that they couldn't get more than about 7-8 rounds out of the belt of ammunition before the mechanism would jam.
So Thompson replaced the belt with a magazine, similar to the ammunition container used in pistols. This meant it didn't generate as much heat as the belt system, so solved another problem. They no longer needed the bulky cooling jacket required by a machine gun. So they were able to use a lighter, simpler solution. A series of fins all along the barrel that transferred heat from inside the gun to the outside.
He had taken a machine gun and made it to where it would not overheat, did not require a water jacket, could be easily reloaded by box magazines or drum magazines, and capable of being carried by the individual soldier. This would become the weapon of its time.
Nice shot.
But by November 1918, when the first shipment of submachine guns was ready, the war was over. Thompson's invention had arrived too late.
The Thompson became basically a wonder weapon that didn't have a war to go fight.
Too late for the Great War, but just in time for Prohibition. Law enforcement agencies loved the new gun. So did the gangsters, who gave Thompson's weapon a nickname, the Chicago typewriter. But General Thompson's invention finally arrived on the real battlefield during World War II.
The Thompson changed the way people thought of what the individual soldier was capable of doing on the battlefield. The individual soldier was a very powerful weapon again.
General Thompson didn't live to see the huge success of his gun as a military weapon. But generations of soldiers whose lives have depended on it still call it the Tommy gun, in honor of its inventor.